The United Kingdom is not exactly living through its finest hour. Despite a few positive figures in recent months, the British economy has been virtually stagnant for years. Debt interest rates have reached record levels not seen in decades. And worst of all, there are no signs that things are going to improve. Great. After the disasters of Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak, it's now the Labour Party's turn. A party which has been warming the bench for many years. Many years. Yet, Keir Starmer's government is turning out to be just like the previous ones. Lots of broken promises. Remember the thing about the Singapore of the Thames? A fiscal black hole that they've decided to defer into the future, crucial reforms that never happen, and to top it all off, lots of internal conflicts. Given this situation, you're probably not surprised by news stories like this.
Political doubts make UK property uninvestable. Sirius CEO says, "We will not invest a penny in the UK in any meaningful form until June after the May elections."
Let's see. It's true that Brexit turned the country into a ship with an unruly rudder, impossible to steer properly. And it's also true that many of the UK's problems predate Brexit, and that Starmer has not been at 10 Downing Street long enough to solve them all. What's truly worrying is not all that, but rather that there are so few reasons to be optimistic. If a car is heading towards a cliff and brakes, well, maybe it will stop in time. Or maybe it won't. But what we have here is a car flooring it, Toretto style. You don't believe me? Well, in this video, we're going to explain how the UK has ended up becoming one of the developed countries with the worst tax systems in the world, just ask my accountant, why Starmer is not going to solve the problem, and in fact, why everything points to the problem getting worse, and most importantly, how Brexit and other problems have made this country ungovernable. Are you ready? Well, let's get started. The UK's problems can be summed up in 2 words: low productivity. The country that gave birth to the Industrial Revolution is simply no longer growing. And let's face it, it's true that Britain's golden age was a long time ago. Since World War I, it was pretty clear that this country would no longer compete for the top spot in the world. But at least it performed like most of the countries around it. The problem? We're talking in the past tense. Take a look at the following graph. Between 1995 and 2007, productivity measured as GDP per hour worked in the United Kingdom experienced the second largest boom within the G7 club. But look what happened following the 2008 crisis. All countries were badly affected, but the British were the worst hit. Over the next 15 years, productivity growth fell from 2.1% per year to just 0.4%, 5 times less. Meanwhile, in most countries, productivity only fell by half. It's true that in France, productivity also grew at 0.4%, but it was already half a percentage point lower than in the United Kingdom. And it's also true that in Italy, it did grow 5 times slower. But let's see. If the excuse is that at least Italy just did as badly, well, let's just give up there. But of course, this is like taking your car to the garage, only to be told that the engine isn't working. Okay, fine. But why isn't it working? Well, in the case of the United Kingdom, there are 3 main reasons, which also explain the problems of its government very well. You know the saying, you reap what you sow. The 2008 crisis was a financial crisis. It then spread to other sectors, such as real estate, and ended up sinking the entire economy. But the origin remained the financial world. And what was one of the main economic sectors in the United Kingdom? Exactly. Finance. London was, and still is, one of the nerve centres of the global stock market, government debt negotiations, and contracts with acronyms that no one really understands. This turned the city into a cash cow for the country's public finances, and no wonder. If you look at this graph, the average wealth of the United Kingdom is not much lower than that of Germany or the Netherlands. However, almost all of this wealth is concentrated in London. Without its main city, this country is more than 20% poorer than Germany without Munich. What's more, the difference in wealth with and without its capital is much greater than that between the US, with and without San Francisco, and even though San Francisco is more than twice as rich as London, and the US is a much more unequal country. And pay attention because this is not just a slowdown, it's a skid. Since the 2008 financial crisis, productivity in the city's financial sector has plummeted, literally by half. Earlier, we talked about productivity growing more slowly. Okay, that was like driving on the highway. But in 3rd gear. Not now. The car is going backwards. Every hour worked in the British financial sector is worth 50% less than it was 15 years ago. And the worst thing is that the trend continues downward. In short, the crisis killed the goose that laid the golden eggs. But hold on, because this was just the first course. A lot of money generates a lot of taxes. For years, the city's finances allowed British politicians to build a welfare state that resembled Scandinavia, but on steroids. The problem? They can no longer afford it. Revenues remain stagnant, while public spending has skyrocketed for two reasons: an increasingly aging population and a system riddled with loopholes and abuses. The result? The deficit is around 5% of GDP, translated about £1,900 per person per year. There are only two ways out of this: either raise taxes or cut spending. So what did Starmer do? Well, the first thing he promised was the latter: to cut spending. Yes, even though he's a Labour politician and comes from a political tradition with a socialist bent, his economic campaign sounded more like Thatcher than Jeremy Corbyn. He talked about reforming pensions, and above all, slashing unemployment and disability benefits. This was a huge expense that was eating into the budget. But of course, he came to power and found a thorn in his side: reality. These kinds of social benefit cuts were politically suicidal. So, like so many others before him, he backtracked. The new idea? Raise taxes, but without making it look like he was raising them. How? Very easy. By not updating income tax brackets in line with inflation, what is known as cold progressivity. The detail? He had promised just the opposite.
1 in 4 to pay UK higher rate of tax if thresholds stay frozen, research shows. This already represented one of the most significant changes to the personal tax system in recent decades, fundamentally reshaping who pays tax and at what rate.
Yes, you heard correctly. Thanks to the income tax freeze, some 5 billion Britons will jump into the high tax bracket, the one that, in theory, is intended for the super rich. And pay attention, because Starmer promised to update the brackets in 2028. That would mean giving up about £9 billion in tax revenue. The reality? The new budgets propose freezing them not until 2028, but until 2031. In short, the government has raised taxes, but in the most inefficient way possible. On the one hand, the system is becoming less progressive. On the other, the big tax revenue won't come in for a few years. And in the meantime, the deficit continues to skyrocket. Government debt continues to grow, and keep in mind, interest rates are through the roof. In other words, this would be the perfect time to pay off debt, but they are doing just the opposite. And this is where things stop being just a political or macroeconomic problem and start becoming a personal one. Because when public debt explodes, interest rates rise, and governments kick the can down the road, the people who pay the price aren't abstract entities, it's savers, workers, and families. And in situations like this, relying entirely on the economic stability of your country is risky, to say the least. Which is exactly why understanding how money, inflation, and investment actually work has never been more important. If you're interested in the world of investing, if you want to learn how to manage your savings, protect yourself against inflation, and figure out how to make money beyond your day job, then I've got some good news for you. At Visual Factory, we've created the Visual Factory Club, a newsletter where every week we send out free content focused on essential financial education, the ABC of what everyone should know to understand the stock market, financial markets in general, investment platforms, how to assess investment opportunities, and which markets may have more or less potential. Because of course, if you want to invest your money so you're not at the mercy of your country's economic instability, you at least need to understand the basics of the financial world. In the Visual Factory Club, you'll learn all of this completely free of charge. Through the link below and this QR code, you can sign up for the club and start receiving the upcoming editions. What's more, when you sign up, you'll receive a dossier where I explain, in a clear and simple way, the most essential investment concepts, what multiples or the PE ratio are, what indices are, ETFs, derivatives, funds, EPS. You get the idea. After that, every week, you'll receive additional materials and market analysis to help you stay informed about what's going on. And by the way, the sooner you sign up, the better. Since we send each episode of the series by email and every edition is unique, if you're not subscribed, you might miss some of them and you won't be able to access them later. But with that said, let's get back into the video. And if you thought this was rock bottom, hold on to your seats. There's a bump coming.
Britain's tax system combines the worst of the US and Scandinavia. The UK's curious experiment in eating the rich while shrinking the state has left Britons less satisfied with their public services than not only Scandinavians but most Americans, and poorer than not only Americans but most Scandinavians.
After the crash of 2008, British politicians rushed to plug the holes as best they could. The result? One of the most clumsy tax systems in the developed world. These days, in the UK, the middle and lower classes pay hardly any taxes, and the rich pay an outrageous amount. To give you an idea, the average worker pays 30% tax, less than in Denmark where they pay 35%, but the richest 10% pay 45%, the same as in Denmark, and almost 10 points more than in the United States. And of course, the United Kingdom is not exactly a paradise full of millionaires, not anymore. There are not enough rich people to sustain the whole system. That's why they froze income tax, so that more people would fall into the higher bracket and pay as if they were rich. And what do we have left? An extremely expensive welfare state that can be barely financed, and that also penalises wealth creation. This used to work because there was a cash cow, the financial sector, and what's more, it was well entrenched in the city, with no easy escape. And if all this weren't enough, the new budget is yet another way of kicking the can down the road. Many more taxes, but the few spending cuts fall especially hard on young families with children. But so long as we're talking about the real problems in the United Kingdom, there's an elephant in the room that's impossible to ignore: Brexit. Everything has already been said about Brexit, but now that a few years have passed, we finally have solid data. And be warned, because analysing this is no easy task. Many of the UK's problems predate Brexit, so separating cause and effect is a mess. Comparing it with other countries doesn't help much either. Since 2020, the UK has done better than Germany. But then again, Germany has done terribly. And it's not enough to look at what happened before and after Brexit, because expectations, announcements, and political noise also influence the economy. Fortunately, a recent study has gone much further. It combined macro data with micro data from 7,000 companies and 2.7 million employees. That's 10% of British private employment. And what does this study say? Well, it confirms the most pessimistic estimates. The British wanted to separate from Europe to create the Singapore of the Thames, a turbo-capitalist paradise with hardly any taxes or regulations. But we've already seen that the tax system has not only worsened, but is now more chaotic and inefficient than ever. Add to this the trade barriers, and it's easy to explain why the United Kingdom is in such a bad way. Brexit has reduced the country's GDP by between 6 and 8%, much more than any economic crisis. Employment has fallen by 3%. As has productivity, and worst of all, investment has suffered between 12 and 18%. Of course, this country has many other problems. For example, it is heavily dependent on gas, while regulations for building renewable and nuclear energy facilities are extremely absurd. They spend £700 million to prevent the death of, wait for it, 8.5 salmon in a decade. No, I promise you, we haven't made this up. It's in an official government report. But compared to the damage caused by Brexit, all these things are mere trifles. This study confirms that the negative effects began to be felt very strongly after the independence referendum in 2016, even though Brexit itself did not happen until 2020, and it highlights a particularly harmful mechanism. The largest and most productive companies were also the most exposed to Brexit. Obviously, a large supermarket chain or telecommunications company is much more vulnerable to this shock than a neighbourhood hair salon. So what happened? As these were the companies that suffered the most losses, capital and labour migrated from them to other companies that were much less productive but more protected from geopolitics. This is particularly negative because it's what could do the most damage in the long term. The largest and most productive companies are also the ones that invest and innovate the most. Brexit has taken away many of their resources and given them to others who, frankly, are going to waste them. Normally, capital flows from the least efficient companies to the most productive ones. But now, capital is flowing from those most exposed to Brexit to those least exposed. Between 2011 and 2015, total factor productivity in all companies fell, but it fell by almost the same amount in both groups, around 0.4%. But following the referendum, companies less exposed to Brexit fell by around 0.05%, while those most exposed, which, let us remember, are also the most productive, and those that should grow the most, suffered a loss of 6%. 12 times greater. Even so, the negative impact on the least exposed companies may have been greater than it appears at first glance. In this study, estimates using macroeconomic data coincide very well with micro-level analyses, except in one case, business investment. Here, the macro estimate is much more damaging than the micro estimate. So which one should we trust? Well, if we look at business investment, it would be best to trust the microeconomic data, which analyzes companies one by one. However, there are reasons to believe that this time, the macroeconomic estimate is better. The fact is that the micro estimate does not take into account the more indirect negative effects of Brexit via the companies that are most exposed. For example, a neighbourhood hair salon is almost invulnerable to Brexit, unless it has to buy scissors from a company that is very vulnerable and, due to Brexit, has to sell them at a higher price. I know it's not the best example in the world, but I think it gets the point across. In more economic terms, we would say that the microestimate does not take into account the general equilibrium effects. In short, the UK was completely dependent on London's financial sector, but this sector collapsed and never recovered, leaving behind a black hole in the budget that keeps getting bigger. All attempts to fix it have failed, and everything points to Keir Starmer throwing in the towel. Conflicts with his cabinet are constant, especially with his Treasury Secretary, who one day promises tax reform and the next day promises the opposite. As if Brexit and its subsequent management of it weren't bad enough, this uncertainty does little to encourage investment. And do you know what the most ironic thing is? Behind Brexit, deep down, was resentment against immigration. Yes, there was a group of very naive politicians who wanted to take advantage of the situation to make far-reaching economic reforms. But let's be honest, those reforms were never the #1 priority for most of their voters. And yet, Brexit has not stopped immigration. Quite the contrary. It's true that the tap of European immigrants has been turned off, but in exchange, the tap of immigrants from outside the EU has been turned on, more than ever, mainly from countries such as India and Pakistan. Meanwhile, the local residents are experiencing an exodus like that of Moses, or at least that's what the latest data indicates. But it must be taken with a grain of salt because the methodology is quite new. In the end, discontent with the new immigration system is so great that the Labour government is drafting an immigration law so restrictive that it would make most of the new European right-wing parties look like nuns. Of course, as we have seen, while the government is focused on the issue of migration, economic problems are piling up and getting bigger every day. But now, it's your turn. Do you think Starmer's government will take the reins and decide to put an end to the budgetary problems, even if it costs them the election? Did you know that the impact of Brexit was so negative? How do you see the future of the country in the next decade? You can leave your answers down in the comments, and don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. If you liked this video, hit like, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. See you next time.